Hello, my loyal 11 subscribers.
It's your friendly neighborhood atheist here.
Alex O'Connor. Founder of the YouTube channel Cosmic Skeptic.
Cosmic Skeptic.
He's very smart.
You grew very fast. It feels like you went from nothing to suddenly hundreds of thousands of subscribers on YouTube.
Something from nothing, as it were. Well, I was just kind of having fun as a teenager. I used to make videos. It's always embarrassing to look at old material, but I'm like swearing.
It's that Abraham.
I look back and I think, this is really bad. It's so clear listening back now that I just didn't understand the argument. But then I look at the comments. You sort of become consumed with arrogance and pride.
To what extent, when you were in that phase, were you taking your cues from the new atheists?
Stylistically, massively.
To be a cosmic skeptic is a dreadful thing to be, just a horrible position.
That's childish, and it was time to move on.
He is no longer Cosmic Skeptic. He's the artist formerly known as Cosmic Skeptic. He's Alex O'Connor.
He has since given up that moniker.
It's become commonplace for people to say that new atheism is either dead or dying.
You're being too philosophical.
I do think it's true that the popularity of it has declined, and I think that's got to do with...
Do you feel like we may be due for people starting to take God seriously again?
Culturally, hugely.
I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments.
As you have obviously engaged at a far deeper level, you did a whole theology and philosophy degree.
I have gone above and beyond what can be reasonably expected of any atheist.
You've really tried to understand and engage and see whether this could be true.
What could I possibly have done differently given the course of my life?
Has the dial moved at all, even just in terms of, I don't think it's quite as unlikely as I used to think that God exists? Has there been any movement whatsoever?
Well...
Hi, Justin here. Before we begin, would you like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God? I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. Go to justinbrierley.com or click the link in the info. Enjoy today's show.
Alex O'Connor, thank you for joining me.
Justin Brierley, it's a pleasure.
Are you still going online as Cosmic Skeptic, or has that kind of gone away now?
No, I got rid of it. I kept the username just because it seemed like a good sort of transition, and also I didn't want to give up the username and then somebody else just randomly takes it,
pretend to be you,
they have all my links or something, because that's one of the practical concerns. But I was getting a bit sick and tired of having to introduce myself with what sounds like an Xbox gamer tag. It was just quite unprofessional, I would sort of meet somebody and I'd tell them what I do, and they'd be like, oh cool, like how do I find you? And I'd sort of have to murmur, it's Cosmic. It always came with like a preface. It's like I made it when I was a teenager.
Are you saying you became a little bit embarrassed by the title? I mean,
yes, I did.
Yeah.
But not because not because I'm embarrassed of being a skeptic, but
or a cosmic one,
or indeed a cosmic one. Although there's a bit of hubris in the cosmic proportions of my skepticism. I just thought it was a cool set of words when I made them, but it does sound a bit. It's childish, it's infantile, and it was time to move on. So now I just go by my name. And I was launching a new podcast at the time, or kind of rebranding my old one to Within Reason. And so since I was already kind of doing a new brand thing, I thought, now's the time. So just did it in a pub one day.
I've been following your content sort of from early years, really. And in a way, the move away from that name, for me, was part of a wider journey that I felt you've been on. Could you describe for me sort of what your tone, what kind of arguments you were making, what the purpose of your videos were when you started? I think it just in your sort of mid-teens, really.
Yeah, I was kind of, in many ways, I was just trying to have fun on YouTube as a teenager. I used to make videos about skateboarding, I used to make guitar tutorials, and then one time I made a response video to a Jehovah's Witness cartoon made by the Watchtower, and it sort of, I posted it on Reddit and it got some popularity, and I was just kind of having fun. I mean, I did sort of also think this was like a deeply homophobic video, but watching that video now, it's always embarrassing to look at old material, but I'm like swearing throughout it.
Some like this, except Abraham, bomb, same chapter, imbecile. I wish Jehovah would be a bit clearer. It looks like we're all for the afterlife. You could leave her the alone, you ignorant homophobe.
I'm not really making like the best points in the world. It's more just a sort of a vibe. I'm just trying to sort of jibe back. Mm-hmm. But it went well and people liked it. So I made more videos like that and started talking about philosophy of religion broadly, but it was in the context of this sort of edgy atheist thing. And so the purpose was much less serious than the work that I try to do now. Now I consider myself as part of that group of people that like to, they always say things like, we have important conversations, or, we have meaningful discussions. And yeah, it's great to try to contribute to that kind of sphere. But there's no way I was doing that back when I was sort of 16 or 17.
Yeah. I mean, you grew very fast. It feels like you went from nothing to kind of suddenly hundreds of thousands of subscribers on YouTube.
Something from nothing, as it were.
Well, indeed. But the videos were quite sort of making quite sort of big claims. They were sort of taking down big arguments in Christian theology and philosophy. What's your reflection on kind of how well you did that at the time?
I think I did well in the sense that the videos performed well. People seemed to like them. People seemed to get on with them. But the argumentative quality, of course, I'm going to look back now and think is not very good. I was so young. I mean, I'm still young. I still don't know what I'm talking about. Nor does anybody when it comes to these big subjects. We can only ever try our best. But I do look back in particular at some of the videos that I made that were a little bit more serious. In particular, I think of the ontological argument video that I made. I made a video about, it was responding to William Lane Craig's little cartoon on the modal ontological argument. And it's so clear listening back now that I just didn't understand the argument. And fair enough, I guess I didn't at the time. That may have been the first time I'd encountered that version of the argument, not really realizing that it was his own version. But the way I'm talking about it, having now spent more hours than anybody should ever have to talking about the ontological argument, and not just publicly, but privately too, and I look back and I think, this is really bad. I'd take it down if it weren't for the fact that I kind of want to show this progression a little bit. I was going to do a response video to it, actually, debunking myself.
Responding to yourself. Yeah.
Already got a bit of a problem at the moment with a reputation for going a bit soft on belief in God. I mean, we recorded a podcast for my show, and you referenced the fact that many people seem to think I'm going to be converting to Christianity because I'm so nice to the people that I talk to. So I think a video debunking my old atheist video might
cement that view too much.
In that video in particular, I can look at it and just say I just essentially didn't know what I was talking about.
That's for me. You are just someone who's growing in understanding. I mean, who of us sort of believes exactly the same things we believed when we were 16 or 17 as a 20 or 30 something
Not quite, yeah.
year old? So that's no surprise. But I'm glad you've got the intellectual humility, which isn't always evident, sadly, in some YouTube spaces, to kind of say, hey, got that one wrong. Actually, my thinking's developed a bit.
Yeah, I remember us talking about this. We did a show with Bishop Barron a few years ago, and I remember, I think you said something like that then. You said, something about intellectual humility and my ability to change my mind. And I remember saying on that show, like, how low is the bar for so-called intellectual humility? If me saying, that thing I said when I was a teenager, I don't think that's actually true. I think, funnily enough, I hadn't gotten right this sort of quite nuanced, analytical, philosophical argument when I was a teenager. For somebody to say, wow, that's, how wonderful. I think it's a display of how bad the state of things is.
To what extent, when you were in that phase, were you taking your cues from the new atheists? I know that you have always been a fan of Christopher Hitchens, for instance.
Of course, yeah. I mean, stylistically, massively. Like the entire system of cutting away at beliefs, responding, identifying fallacious ways of thinking, this kind of thing is hugely influenced by that culture of new atheism. The actual beliefs themselves, or the arguments, surely when it came to talking about creationism and evolution, if I made a video about that, then a lot of what I knew would have come from the likes of Richard Dawkins, also people like Jerry Coyne. The content would have mattered there. But talking about the ontological argument, for example, I can't really remember a time that the new atheists have talked about it outside of like Dawkins in the God Delusion, and he makes a pretty botched job of it, I think. Doesn't really take it very seriously,
I've forgotten the details, but I once piqued a gathering of theologians and philosophers by adapting the ontological argument to prove that pigs can fly. They felt the need to resort to modal logic to prove that I was wrong.
Well, this is just embarrassing. The ontological argument just is an exercise in modal logic, the logic of the necessary and the possible. I can just imagine what the philosophers and theologians whom Dawkins piqued at that conference must have been thinking.
So the actual content itself, I think, was never original, because everybody learns something from somewhere. The ideas always have a genesis somewhere, but I think it was a sort of a mixed bag. But the main influence of the New Atheist was probably in what it was that I was doing and the style in which I was doing it, rather than the actual beliefs themselves.
Why have you, in a sense, then changed your style from those early years?
In part because looking back at that ontological argument video, the thing that strikes me is that I listen to it and I think, my goodness, this is poor. But then I look at the comments and they say how wonderful the video is and how much they learned from it. I saw one person commented that this was really useful for them because they had their A-level exams coming up in philosophy of religion. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've made this person fail. This is, I think to myself, it would have been so easy for me at the time, which is certainly what I did, to look at this material, look at what people are saying and say, yeah, cool, I'm great at this. This is fantastic. And so you sort of become consumed with arrogance and pride. And so realizing that you're wrong about a lot of these things, and realizing how confident you were, not just due to general confidence, but due to the fact that you were having people telling you all the time, oh, this is great material. And now realizing how wrong that was makes me very careful now. Like I wouldn't want to put forth that style of argumentation that says, well, this is why I'm right. I know that I'm right. And people who disagree with me are wrong and silly and this kind of thing, which is not quite what I was saying, but there's a sort of attitude about it, right? Which I tried to move away from.
There's a certain sort of rhetoric that goes with that approach, which it feels like that softened in the way that you bring things.
But it's unhelpful to have conversations generally. It's great for sort of making a bit of content or something, or, in a debate, having that moment you can clip, that kind of thing. But, I've been the victim of that myself many times. People are always clipping things that I'm doing and doing the same thing. And I just realized it's a bit of a sort of ugly space. But also there is just a self-preservation motivation. If that's not enough for you, in other words, think to yourself, like, if you get proven wrong on this, the way that you presented the argument is going to have a huge effect on how you're going to be able to respond to that, Because if you put it forward nicely and calmly and genuinely open to discussion, then when you get proven wrong, fantastic, it's success. But if you've been a little bit more forceful with it,
you don't have to double down on something that was kind of shaky to begin with.
Hi, Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you want to support my work, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get signed copies of both my books and the chance for monthly catch-ups. The links are with the info. And now, back to where we left off.
What do you make of the movement as a whole, though? Because arguably, I would say possibly that in your early years of your channel and your content, you were sort of riding a bit of the wave of that new atheism, and obviously influenced by some of its architects. But what do you think? Where do you think we're at now with that movement as a whole that kind of influenced your early material?
I think that it's become commonplace for people to say that new atheism is either dead or dying. It's still quite difficult to define exactly what new atheism is, but I think it's like they say of pornography, it's impossible to define, but you know it when you see it. That kind of thing, We all know what we're talking about with new atheism here. And I do think it's true that the popularity of it has declined. And I think that's got something to do with the meaning crisis that I know that you reference in your book. The idea that it's almost like we didn't have enough time when you're watching these debates and it's about the existence of God, and you become compelled to think there's no evidence for God. And just slipped in is this piece about, and a worldview based on science is far more awe-inspiring and fulfilling than a religious one anyway. And you sort of, sounds great, beautiful. But then, people have actually tried to live it. They try to live with the conviction that there is no God, that the heavens are empty, that there is no objective morality, that everybody just gets to decide for themselves what they want to do, and find themselves a bit nihilistic. And so even if they can't bring themselves to say that the new atheists were incorrect, they're less enthusiastic about it as a movement. Now, of course, there are people who don't do that. Like not everybody who's like an atheist becomes a nihilist, and not everybody thinks that you can't have objective morality without God or whatever. But I think that this is a common thought. I would receive emails and messages from people who say, oh, I saw your video about free will and it convinced me there's no free will, but I'm having a bit of an existential crisis about it. How do you live like that? Or sometimes people just saying, look, I've lost my faith in God, but it was so meaningful to me that, I don't know what to do with myself. I think that maybe enough people feeling that way, and the people who sort of talk about new atheism being dead often describe an experience like that of themselves, that, they've realized that it hasn't put anything worthwhile in its place, means that, like I say, doesn't mean they can say the new atheists were wrong or incorrect, but it's not like a cause they're going to rally around.
It's not going to give them a roadmap for how they should live their life, just being told God doesn't exist in that sense. I guess one of the key claims of the new atheism is that religion was not only false, but bad for you, bad for the world. Is that something you have held yourself? Is that something you still hold today? Have your thoughts changed on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've said in the past that saying religion is bad is a bit like saying politics is bad. There's a sense in which that's deeply true. Everybody hates politics. And in a sense, if somebody says the world would be better without politics, you know what they mean.
Yes.
Like, yeah, okay, fair enough. But like, it's not to say that there isn't a correct political view. I mean, if there's enough variance in religious belief, then even somebody who believes the true religion will have to think that religious belief is responsible for a great deal of evil, because there are so many false doctrines surrounding them. And so to say religion is bad is kind of it's a bit. If it's true, then I think it's trivially true, because there's so much variance within religious thinking. But the question of whether, like, religious thinking, this is the criticism that's often made. It's not so much religion, but that kind of thinking, faith-based thinking, the willingness to sacrifice evidence in favor of wishful thinking, this kind of thing. Is that bad? Well, it's probably not going to help you get to truth. It probably leaves you prone to indoctrination, radicalization, this kind of thing. But will you be happier for taking that approach? Maybe. So it kind of just depends on what your metric is. Indeed, that's probably why people do it. And that's the atheist criticism. They say, well, of course, like, people are going to be happier doing that. That's our entire point, is that that's why they're doing it, not because it's true, but because it makes them happy. But I think, some people, especially as they get older, especially as they get closer to death, might think to themselves, well, okay, but what do I want here? That isn't happiness, aren't we often told a lot of the time by atheist moral philosophies like utilitarianism, that happiness is actually the goal here? In which case, why are we doing these debates? Why are we, like, going around trying to convince people? I had a debate with Sabur Ahmad, a Muslim, he's part of, like, the Dawa scene. And at one point in the debate, I remember him saying something like, well, if you think that, like, maximizing pleasure, minimizing suffering is the metric for morality, then why are you here? Why are you doing this? Even if you think it's true that there's no God, if studies show that people who believe in God are happier and more fulfilled, then don't you have a moral obligation to shut up? He didn't put it in those words. But I remember thinking afterwards about that and thinking, like, yeah, that's an interesting question. Maybe there is something about the decline of new atheism that's got to do with the fact that even if people still think it's true, they think, that it's going to make people less happy somehow, and therefore they don't want to spread it anymore.
I feel like a lot of the new atheists have stopped talking about religion by and large. It feels like the conversation's moved on almost. So I suppose first question is, where did the energy go in that movement, and what are some of those people talking about now?
Well, there's a certain extent to which you sort of run out of things to talk about. I mean, there's only so many times and so many ways that you can say, I don't think that God exists, especially if you're one of these sort of I lack a belief in God types. Then, the poverty of new arguments on your front is a result of the poverty of new arguments on the religious front. I mean, we're still talking about the same arguments that were available to Plato. There's nothing sort of new here. And so people have a new approach. They write a new book. They come up with a new analogy. The celestial dictator, the sort of divine North Korea. Cool, that's an interesting way of making the criticism that God is something like a tyrant. And that is genuinely novel. That's new. That's helping people think about it in a new way. But the underlying arguments are the same. It's just a new way of expressing them. And once you've done that, yeah, you can do your book tour and you can do a bunch of debates, but it starts to just kind of get old. People aren't going to listen anymore because you're saying the same thing over and over again, and so you sort of have to change topic anyway. So I wouldn't. I think it would be easy to say, look at how all the new atheists have just given up talking about atheism. It's because they've realized that atheism sucks. No, maybe it's just because they feel like they've sort of job done.
No, it might be. It might be. I almost wonder whether, to some extent, the new atheism was primarily being driven by people who still remembered the inheritance of, having to sing hymns in primary school and, sort of some kind of forms of compulsory religious activity and so on. And now that by and large is going away, now that we're living, I think, in an increasingly post-Christian culture than the one they grew up in, it's almost like there's less for the new atheist to respond to increasingly as we get more post-Christian. So I don't know if that's the same thing as what you've just described in a way.
That's possibly true as well. Although I think it's hard to say how much the decline in religious belief was a result of new atheism. It might be that the success of new atheism was a result of the decline of religious belief, if you know what I mean. Like, it's possible that these just correlated. Had this idea that new atheism becomes popular and Richard Dawkins and his crew convince the world to become atheists. It might not be that that's the case. It might be that sort of just generally living in a fairly post-Christian culture means that people are becoming less religious, and Dawkins is just somebody who manages to put it into a book and put it into words what people are already feeling, and that describes the success. And so I'm not really sure. It's hard to say.
Do you think in the big picture of things now, with the new atheism sort of more in the back mirror, people are more willing, because of that movement, to describe themselves as an atheist? Has it also taken on potentially pejorative kind of aspect that some people don't want to be associated with the kind of atheism that represented?
I think there's definitely a kind of person who makes atheism like a thing, right? And surely I'm one of those people in the sense that this is like my job. It's what I talk about. And so if somebody at a party asks me what I do, what I talk about, I find myself suddenly talking about atheism, even if only briefly it gets a mention. It's very rare, I think, now for somebody to sort of show up to a party and within 5 minutes being introduced to somebody have mentioned atheism. So I think that if somebody asks, what do you think about God? And you say you're an atheist, I don't think there's any pejorative, ascription to that word. I don't think that there's any implication that they identify with the new atheist movement and that they like Richard Dawkins. They just don't believe in God. But if somebody isn't asked, if somebody makes a point of describing themselves as an atheist, if you ask them, what are your interests? And they say, I'm sort of interested in atheism, although I don't think they quite phrase it like that. You know what I mean? If they bring it up themselves, then I think people would look at it and say, maybe there's a Richard Dawkins fanboy or something. That's not to do with the label. That's kind of to do with the way that somebody's employing it and using it. So I don't think the label itself has changed massively due to new atheism.
But in a sense, you tend to use it as a helpful kind of description of the types of things you do and talk about it in that sense. I'm sure you don't go around the whole time kind of using it as a self-descriptor.
If you meet someone who says, I'm really interested in atheism, if that's what they say to you, then that kind of is just shorthand for saying that, they're probably part of the new atheist crowd. They probably like watching these kinds of YouTube videos. They like Richard Dawkins, that's probably the kind of thing that they're talking about, in a way that if you ask a random person on the street, do you believe in God? And they say, no, I'm an atheist, it doesn't indicate that at all.
The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Now you can listen to all of Season 1. Discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of new atheism. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
My feeling is that there were a lot of people who were directly kind of interested in adopting or kind of seeing themselves as part of this new atheist movement. Some of them may have kind of drifted away from it in some way. I think there were a lot of others who were just interested in being around intellectually interesting people, you know, and kind of interesting cultural sort of dynamics going on there. I feel like some of that energy of that movement has, in a sense, gone over to other thinkers who aren't particularly concerned with the label of whether they're an atheist or not. People like Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein and Douglas Murray, Tom Holland. There's a kind of interesting, I think, fruitful kind of interesting engagement going on in those circles as people talk about, you know, important issues around culture, around religion, around atheism and so on. But I get the sense, I'd just be interested in whether you feel this as well, that religion is no longer being seen as an enemy. It's sort of being seen as at one level, maybe a necessary evil almost by some people. For others, a kind of actually a good thing, a thing that actually we shouldn't wish away necessarily. What's your feeling about kind of where that conversation has gone in
I think people are definitely less confident in the way that the new atheists in like 2006, 2007. And also I meant to say that, you know, I think I was either 6 or 7 years old when The God Delusion came out. So when you were asking me about sort of how new atheism has changed the landscape,
you weren't that concerned.
I'm not really the
more into Power Rangers.
The authority, yeah. Although I guess normally I would have been a Catholic at that point, so maybe there's that. But in terms of at that time, you hear really confident portrayals of religion as this horribly evil force. I think today people might still think that religion is bad and responsible for a lot of evil, but not as confidently, perhaps. And also, there's just been too much discussion and debate making it obvious that somebody who just says religion is bad just doesn't have the necessary nuance to be meaningfully talking on the subject. Enough people have responded and say, look, clearly this can't just be, like I said earlier about politics being bad. I think that's how it strikes people now. It's almost naive to say something so broad. But people still think that many forms of religious belief and religious thinking, as faith-based thinking, is still bad. But I think this idea of them seeing it as like a good thing or something like that can have a lot to do with the fact that people like to have, or common enemies, as it were, bring people together. And so we talked in our podcast episode about Peter Boghossian, a big sort of atheist guy, you know, certainly not a Christian by any standards, but when he starts, you know, railing against woke culture and realizes that Christians don't like that too, they're friends now, you know, and now he's actually, maybe this Christianity thing's got something going for it. Douglas Murray might think, I'm an atheist and Christianity is a incorrect and homophobic religion or something. But when Douglas Murray becomes preoccupied with thinking about Islam and Islamic terrorism and fundamentalism, and he thinks, well, one of the ways to stop people from being Islamic terrorists is for them to be Christians. Maybe I quite like this sort of Christian culture thing, you know. And so it's, in many ways, I think it's people discovering that they have a common cause with something like, it's hard to say religion, but something like Christianity, or with Islam, because it happens with Islam too. A lot of people, like young people, are being attracted to it, I think, because that there's sort of a culture around Islam giving young men in particular feelings of responsibility and dignity and standing up for yourself and this kind of thing. And so you're seeing people become a bit attracted to Islam, and even if they don't become Muslims, it's just sort of culturally you find that they'll use some of the religious language, or maybe you find that they won't be eating pork or something, even though they're not really religiously Muslim, because there's something about the culture that appeals to them. I think that's basically what's going on.
Yeah. At a personal level, you don't believe in God, as you made clear at the beginning of the interview. As you have, though, obviously engaged at a far deeper level, you did a whole theology and philosophy degree, you've taken a lot of time to look into these things, you've lived with Christians, you've really tried to understand and engage and see whether this could be true. Has the dial moved at all, even if it's even just in terms of, I don't think it's quite as unlikely as I used to think that God exists. Has there been any movement whatsoever on your...
Well, it's kind of hard to say, because it's difficult to remember exactly where my mind was, a at any particular point in the past. There's this opening statement to a debate with Jonathan McGlatchy, which I re-uploaded as a standalone video called "This is Why I Don't Believe in God." And in the center, I talk about the fact that I've tried all of these things, that I've got my degree, that I live with Christians, that I did all kinds of things, and then I say that there was nothing. That absolutely nothing. I've experienced nothing after all of this effort that speaks to the existence of the God in the universe. And I remember thinking at the time, like, this is true in a sense and not in another. Experientially, which is kind of, I'm talking about the problem of divine hiddenness in that particular speech. And have I ever like experienced something that speaks to God's existence? I can't honestly say that I have. You know, I've had like weird experiences and, you know, moments that every human has, moments that they can't quite describe. But I wasn't like, oh, this, you know, this has to be God.
The light bulb didn't come on.
You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, I remember thinking when sometimes, like, if I'm like, yeah, like I'm in a sort of half dreaming state and I feel something weird, and I think to myself, oh, was that something a bit religious? Like there's a sense in which that kind of speaks to the existence of God. I'm considering it. So I was a little bit like, is it true? Like nothing. In terms of the experience, I think probably, but in terms of arguments, like I think that the arguments, I consider them more tenable now than I did before, and I think that they are that there are more of them that are essentially, you know, successful at moving the dial, and so in the intellectual space, yeah, I think I take religion or like theism, I should say, much more seriously than I did before. Still not convinced, but I would say that the dial has moved in that sense, that I take it much more seriously and think that there's some good arguments in favor of that. So in that clip where I say nothing, you know.
Nothing. Not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe.
I'm talking experientially there. In terms of argument, I think it's a slightly different story.
Do you feel like it would be an experience that would have to be there? Yeah. Because when I asked Douglas Murray this question, he said, I'd have to hear a voice.
Yeah, it'd have to be something like that, I think. I'm not sure what it would be, but something like that. I mean, I also take more seriously now the sort of story and narrative of religion. Christianity in particular, the figure of Jesus, you know, it's sort of easy to make videos or to make criticisms of Jesus being this like stupid or immoral figure, but like really taking the time to sort of look at the figure of Jesus through the eyes of a Christian. What is it that Jesus does for Christians? Like I take that a lot more seriously too, and realize that a lot of the most moving parts of the gospel are the experiential moments where the penny drops for somebody, when somebody is healed, when somebody sees somebody else being healed, this kind of thing. It's those moments that have the most weight, and also the moments that make people convert. I mean, the disciples that follow Jesus often do so because they see him perform a miracle. They experience something. They experience something that they can't explain, and they say, okay, Lord, I'm going to follow you. Famously, doubting Thomas has to sort of have the experience of touching the wound, for he says, you know, my Lord and my God. I think it's to be expected that the thing that's going to convince somebody to start following any religion or person like Jesus is probably going to be experiential. I think that's no less true for me than anybody else.
Could you put your finger on what that might need to look like in your life if it were to ever happen?
I often hear people describe that they just suddenly feel the presence of love, that they just suddenly somehow recognize that they're unconditionally loved. I mean, obviously, you know, I spend time with friends and family and I think, oh, that's really nice. Yeah, I feel like they love me. But you hear this description of even just fleetingly somebody feeling an unconditional love. That's quite vague. But I mean, I'm not asking for too much. I'm not sort of asking for spell it out in the sky kind of thing. But something like that, I think, would be quite powerful. Right. Especially if it came at, you know, the end of a long reflection on the Gospels, or I'd been sort of having a religious debate, or we'd have this conversation. You know, if I left this room and suddenly I just felt almost like I was high for a minute, inexplicably, and it was distinctly this feeling of like, gosh, I'm loved unconditionally by someone or something. That would be the kind of thing that I think would move the dial. I don't know if it would be enough to make me, you know, become religious.
I suppose
but that's the kind of thing I think I'm talking about.
The problem is, I suppose you can always, if you're so inclined, find an an explanation for that doesn't have to be religious.
That's right.
But as you say, there's always a lot going on, I suppose.
But that's what I'd want to resist as well. It's like that's why it's difficult to answer the question, because I wouldn't want to just like brush off any experience that isn't 100% definitely God as not at least, counting in favor, as you said, moving the dial.
Just final question. Do you feel like there's any merit in my thesis? You don't have to agree with the book. You can be as critical as you like of it, but that we may be due for people starting to take God seriously again in our culture at an intellectual, cultural, kind of sociological level.
Well, those are three different questions. I think intellectually, maybe not. I'm a bit more pessimistic about the idea than you are. I think that people are just going to start believing in God again. That the arguments are certainly going to start working for people. I just don't see that happening. Culturally, hugely. It's already happening in many places. It's happening across the world with Christianity. In this country, Islam is growing quickly. It's already happening. It's happening with Christianity across the world. It's happening with Islam in this country is growing quite quickly, and people are becoming attracted to it. And like I said before, I think this has got a lot to do with culture more than the intellectual arguments. I think that a young person who decides that they want to convert to Islam in this country is as much, motivated by a feeling of cultural belonging and perhaps more so identity than they are by some like intellectual analytical argument that the Quran is the word of God or something. You know what I mean? So I think it's possible that it's going to happen, and it's probably going to be due to the meaning crisis and the chasm of meaning left by new atheism, as you might describe it. But it's not going to be an intellectual rebirth in my view, but a cultural, spiritual one, if you like.
Super interesting chatting with you. Thank you. And all the best as you continue your journey, having interesting conversations and tracing, where these conversations go in the future.
Anytime. Thanks, Justin. I don't see what this has got to do with belief in God.
A lot of people who were holding on to the atheist materialist thing have been let down.
We're not talking about a surprising rebirth of belief in the utility of believing in God.
There's a hunger, a spiritual thirst.
The kind of Christianity that returns might be the kind of strong-armed, aggressive, arrogant Christianity that we've been quite right to criticize and condemn.
The fact that you find those verses morally repugnant is because if you liked that interview with atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor, then watch what happened when we debated each other in front of a live audience next. And you can visit justinbrierley.com to sign copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving. Supporters can get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. That's justinbrierley.com.